I'm going to present the report that was collectively generated to document the continued and ongoing attacks on education in Palestine and on Palestinians. And I think, just as a reminder for those who were here last time, this is what that report looked like. And this year the report has doubled in size. And it's not a report one wants to write, but it's a report that's important to write because it documents and it provides evidence of the ongoing attacks and scholasticide that we will talk about now. And the report talks about at least more than 1.5 million children who have been denied the right to schooling in Gaza, West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Currently, one can fairly say that there is no such thing as formal education. There is education, but formal education as we know it no longer exists. And this attack, as the previous speaker and the ambassador pointed out, go to the next slide. This attack is not the only one. It has a long history of attacks on education, beginning as far back as 1948 and has been continuing. So to talk about education under occupation, it's been permanent occupation, and the disruption and attacks have been relentless. It's just intensified over periods of time, but it's been systematic, it's ongoing, and therefore the report starts with the quote that there is no post in the trauma that a Palestinian child experienced, because trauma and attacks is ongoing. The report we use draws on two sources of data. Don't worry about the PowerPoint, they'll get it running at some point. It draws on primary data. We use, those are conversations and interviews with government officials, international organization staff, local organization staff, teachers and students. And it also includes a very systematic desk review of existing reports done by various agencies, international and national, data from Ministry of Education, and data from Education Management Information System. So the narrative of the report knits together primary interview data with documentary data to provide evidence, both documentary and testimonial, about what education under attack looks like. And the still in the title refers to an important part. It refers to the ongoing nature of the attack. And in the next slide, it simply documents the number of teachers that are killed and the number of students that are killed and are injured. And it tells you both in West Bank and Gaza, what we're seeing is not just direct attacks on infrastructure, as I'll point now, but direct attacks on people and on their ability to teach, their ability to work, and their ability to learn. But the slide tells us something more. The attacks are not physical. The attacks are also through forced hunger, starvation, and in August 2025, the declaration of famine in Gaza. If you go to the next slide, the slide after that, I'm going to now talk about Gaza. Basically, I think we don't need to say this more. Almost all government schools have been destroyed. Almost all UNRWA schools have been destroyed, and almost all private schools have been destroyed. The physical infrastructure, that doesn't mean education hasn't continued and doesn't continue, because education still continues, but the physical infrastructure has been destroyed. And the physical infrastructure extends beyond schooling. It extends to the archives, as our reports pointed out, and it's part, we would argue, the erasure of the cornerstone of Palestinian identity, which is education. So the physical infrastructure of the school becomes a site of attack, and therefore it dissociates as an important space for education and for the assertion of identity. And that's what we're witnessing in Gaza. And the next slide talks about the wars and the attacks not only kills, but it also injured. And since 2023 to now, we've noticed a number, the data speaks to a number of injured children increasing, children needing rehabilitation, child amputees. Out of the injured children, 15% are child amputees. Out of the total injured children, 20% need rehabilitation. So we're not just talking about recovery and restoring schooling, we're also talking about the conditions under which schooling occurs. Okay. All right, so let me see. Shall I put this up? Okay. If we move to the next slide after that, but the attacks has been on all children, but it has differently impacted girls and boys. Many boys and young men have been killed trying to get food and for their families. Many girls have an absence. Over 95% of girls report the inability to use toilets safely during displacement. 75% of monthly sanitary pad needs are unmet due to fivefold price increases. Boys had to struggle and to get food and work in hazardous work to survive. But beyond that, this is the learning loss we've calculated. The report calculates learning loss. And it estimates that if schools were to reopen in 2025, which kind of did not happen, we saw 5 years of learning loss. If they do open in 2026 fully, you're witnessing 7.5 years of learning loss. This is learning loss that includes learning loss due to trauma, learning loss due to hunger, and learning loss due to the inability to learn. And if you stretched it to 2027, you're talking of an entire danger of a generation of an entire generation of lost learning. Think of the reality of a child born a year ago. By the time they get to school, they'll miss at least more than 5 to 10 years of schooling if this occurs in 2027. And that's quite an important message of the report, that the calculations of learning loss factors into account the forced hunger, starvation, and famine illness, as well as the trauma. And therefore, the calculations we do later will talk about learning recovery and what it will take. But as the ambassador spoke to, school may be destroyed, but learning continues. So in the next slide, we talk about how school continued. And it continued for a period during the ceasefire, a temporary ceasefire, but it still continued in very informal ways. It continued in the form of temporary learning spaces. It continued in the form of distance learning. And it also continued for the Tawjihi students, who we should applaud for managing to continue and complete their Tawjihi exam in the midst of this attack. And that speaks to the steadfastness and the resistance and the importance attached to education in Palestine. A crucial constituency are teachers and counselors. They have been on the front line of the attacks. They have, despite living under 18 years of blockade, over 2 years of intense bombardment and starvation, they have demonstrated commitment to serving their communities and affirming their students' identity and their right to education. So teachers have continued. And as to quote, we know that many teachers have lost children themselves. They have been displaced. Many of these women have struggled. We know from our work with teachers that they still want to be teaching. So they've taken on more than teaching roles. They've taken roles of providing support, shelter, and trauma counseling. If we continue to the next slide. So when we look at teachers, one of the important things we did in the report was to calculate what we call learning recovery and the number of teachers that would be needed. And there are two calculations that are based on that table. I won't go to the detail of them, but it assumes that a lot of the teachers, 30% of teachers may not be able to return because of injury or trauma. It also calculates the number of teachers you need to replace those who have been killed. It also talks about the number of teaching or teacher assistants you will need to provide additional learning support, because when children return to schooling, they'll need additional support to compensate or to remediate the years that they've suffered of learning loss. The total estimated cost, so the figure that the ambassador cited, excludes the cost of at least 448 million needed for teachers to support learning and recovery. So what we're talking about, 465. Now, I'm going to talk very briefly, and I'm mindful of time, about West Bank. That was Gaza. If we go to West Bank and East Jerusalem has also suffered. And the attacks have been different, but nonetheless attacks. It's been through blockades at checkpoints. It's been use of weapons in and near school. It's been forced entry by Israeli forces into schools. It's been settler attacks and destructions of schooling. It's been demolition orders against communities and schools. And it's been direct vandalism of school infrastructure. And as the official said, when you sit with the students, instead of talking to you about maths and science, they start talking about how they saw their friend or neighbor shot. So clearly people are learning, but they're learning something very different than what we think they should be learning or expect to learning. They're learning directly about violence, and they're learning directly about occupation. And like the Gaza, girls and boys in the West Bank are impacted differently as well. Boys' school attendance has suffered, so has girls. Harassment and surveillance have continued. Basic needs and dignity have been impossible or hard to attain for girls due to water cuts and shortages. We go to the next slide. We've also then calculated, similarly to Gaza, the learning loss in West Bank. And this is to make the point that it's the entire Palestinian education system that's under attack. And here again, while the figures are lower than Gaza, they're nonetheless serious. At least 3.5 years if school opens in 2025, 4 years in 2026, and 5.5 years in 2027. So again, a similar kind of learning loss, not obviously on the same scale, but important to recognize that the attacks on education in West Bank, including East Jerusalem, continues. We've also calculated, and the calculations are higher because the number of teachers are higher. And again, we've calculated teachers who can't return or might not be able to return, the replacement teachers needed, and the teaching assistants or teaching support we might require. And we've worked out an estimate cost. And I think it's important because many reports and many calculations do not calculate the cost of teachers. And therefore, the figures we're citing needs to be, the figures that were cited needs to add the importance of teachers. If we just end with this quote about teachers, this is the teachers' voice themselves. We should not forget the teachers. They are the forgotten workers who are persisting. A portion of them are also in the displacement camps and have lost their homes, are financially struggling. The teacher is expected to have a good outlook in front of students, even though they are in the same situation. And this talks to the steadfastness and the resilience of teachers who, despite their own direct attacks on their well-being and that of their families and communities, they continue to provide education. All of this and these attacks and scales are not matched by support for education. And in the few slides I'm going to present now, I'm going to talk about the international financing and international commitment. And in the next slide, you'll see that of the amount requested for education, only 5.7% is funded. 94.3% funding get. This is not about funding alone. It's about the sign of what the international community thinks where its priorities are, and it's about whose lives it thinks matters most. So where it puts its money and where it chooses not to put its money is a testament to the values that they have. If we go to the next slide, I think I'm sure Julia will speak about this more. The share of humanitarian aid to UNRWA has drastically fallen, and it continues to fall. It's not just physical attacks on infrastructure of UNRWA schools. It's not the banning of UNRWA's facilities and operation. It's also that there's a deliberate decline. And an attack on UNRWA is an attack on Palestinian education and Palestinian identity as well. UNRWA is simply the vehicle and the mechanism, and it's an attack on that. Now, I won't go through this, but I'll just flag 3 facts, which I think the ambassador spoke about. That we currently need at least $1,155. We're only getting $9 currently. I mean, you don't need to be good in maths to figure out it's almost an impossible answer to work it out. And this tells us again, in a similar way, what the priorities of the international community, but generally anybody. And the international community also includes the immediate neighbors surrounding Palestine, right? The neighbors who surround the borders of Palestine, the borders of Gaza as well, as our report documents as well. So we do end up with recommendations. And I'm going to now talk about some of the recommendations. We have 4 sets of important recommendations, and they're fairly straightforward and almost obvious and something that's a priority. The first is to rebuild safe, inclusive, and resilient education systems. In other words, we need education that's safe, education spaces that are protected. We need to support learning and empower the students. We need to enable and empower teachers and counselors. Right? And we need to crucially uphold international law and ensure international funding for education. We need to ensure that those who are responsible are held accountable, and those who have a responsibility for support do play their roles. But crucially, most importantly, we end up with that any effort at education reconstruction must center Palestinian perspectives, right? And it must start with the most obvious thing, which must be to formally recognize the state of Palestine as a legitimate and inalienable right of the Palestinians, and the state of Palestine as leading all reconstruction efforts. No plans, no boards, no executive committees can substitute for the state of Palestine taking the lead in any effort at education recovery. And in that, the Palestinian children, educators, and communities must lead the recovery and reconstruction planning. And for that, all efforts and all actors must restore and support the Ministry of Education and higher education systems through renewed policy, planning, and financing mechanisms. But I think the most powerful message is in the last slide, and I'm going to end with the voice of a teacher. I'm pleased to end with the voice of a teacher. The most important message to the international community is that this is the time to end occupation. Everything after that will be solved. The problem is 75 years old because of the occupation. End the occupation to give Palestinians their rights. This is the only message we have to send all over the world. And so restoring rights and stopping the denial of rights is about ending the occupation, which has 75 years or more of history. Thank you.